March 30th, 2022. The first episode of Disney Plus's Moon Knight was released. Needless to say, I was excited. There were some odd things in the trailer, but overall I was still excited. The first episode was good. It was good. It mostly focused on Steven, and he was pretty good. Wasn't much like his comic counterpart, but they didn't really have much to work with from him. The brief snippets of comic Moon Knight we got was cool. Hearing Khonshu, seeing small snippets of Mark before his inevitable donning of the costume, and that amazing final scene was cool. 1 week later, April 6th, 2022, I decided that there were no good things in life, and I am to swallow a bullet. Who is Moon Knight? Moon Knight first debuted in Werewolf by Night number 32, releasing in August of 1975 before getting his own series in 1980. He's under a lot of Batman comparisons over the years, and despite being inaccurate, it's not difficult to see why. Fights crime at night in a very dark and corrupt city, throws his logo at people, he's rich, but he's also very different from them. Moon Knight suffers from a mental illness known as dissociative identity disorder. He has 3 alters. Mark Spector, who usually plays the protagonist role, is a character constantly struggling with himself. He's a difficult man to love. Steven is a little bland, to be honest. He was initially the protagonist, but nowadays, now that Mark has taken that role, he doesn't really have much to do. He's mostly just the money guy now. He's also a pacifist, which is one of his only major traits. Thirdly is Jake Lockley. Jake is cool, charming, and a bit of a scoundrel. He can have a temper, but he's also got a heart of gold. He won't fight you without a reason. Moon Knight was created when, after dying by the statue of the Egyptian god of the moon, Khonshu, Mark was resurrected with the goal of protecting the travelers of the night. Khonshu is manipulative. He's cruel, and for the majority of his history it was a little unclear whether or not he was even real, or just a figment of Mark's shattered mind. That is a very basic rundown. All this makes him a very complicated character to adapt. I can understand why shows like Marvel's Spider-Man and Avengers Assemble don't really try to make him very unique, and I understand why shows like Ultimate Spider-Man take a lot of liberties. What I cannot understand, however, is how a show entirely focused on him winds up this different. Imagine a Batman show released where Batman did not want to be Batman. He was not Batman by choice. He did not want to help people. He didn't want to fight crime in Gotham. Instead, he lived in Metropolis. He was a middle-class guy who worked at a convenience store. Batman, Jim Gordon, and Black Cat were the only characters from Batman actually in the show. Alfred was name-dropped, and Robin showed up in a missed call screen. Batman tripped over his balls the whole time. Black Cat was renamed Clackbat, and the only thing that even remotely resembles Batman was his costume and Jim Gordon. Jim Gordon was a perfect adaptation of Jim Gordon. The villain was like Sid the Squid, and he acted exactly like Riddler, but he was called Sid the Squid. Also, Batman has superpowers, and this is the only major adaptation he will ever receive. That's what the Moon Knight show is like. The problems with the show really begin with episode 2. We're introduced to Layla in this episode, and she's a rework of Mark's major love interest from the books. Layla is different from Marlene in 2 ways. Her name, obviously, and the fact that she doesn't suck ass. I actually like Layla. Comic Marlene was this very bland and oddly ableist damsel in distress a lot of the time. Layla's a lot more proactive, and I'd actually watch a whole show of her just being cool. What I don't like, however, is that they made Stephen Grant and Mr. Knight the same, and how all subtlety was removed from the comic's fantasy elements. There is no doubt Khonshu is real. There is no doubt that Ammit is real. There is no doubt about any of this mythology. That's bad, but I can live with it. It becomes an issue later, though, when they try to convince you it actually was fake all along. It doesn't work. The bigger problem, though, is what they do to Mr. Knight. Taking the Mr. Knight identity away from Mark and giving it to Stephen was probably the show's most controversial decision, so I'm not going to talk about it that much. All I'm going to say is that they make both Mark and Stephen less interesting. This is also when Stephen goes from better than his comic counterpart to the most annoying fucking guy I've ever seen. Stephen goes from an entertaining audience surrogate to the cringiest attempt at forced comic relief I have ever seen. Breaks all tension almost immediately. The tonal shift in this scene is something the entire show suffers from. It only gets worse from here. Episode 3 is just bad. That's all, it just sucks. There's this really bad fight scene, and at the end, and they need to find this MacGuffin, and then they get the moving night sky scene, which is cool, and then Khonshu gets turned into a rock. Speaking of Khonshu, he's perfect. He's the Jim Gordon in this Batman comparison. Everything about him is perfect. His design, his writing, his voice is absolutely incredible. F. Murray Abraham deserved that Emmy. To be honest, all of the show's performances rock. Oscar Isaac was miscast. He really should have been Jewish, but he works well with what he's given. May Calloway and Ethan Hawke do their best too. Speaking of Ethan Hawke, he's an entertaining villain, but he's not a particularly memorable one. He's great in the first 2 episodes, but he's not that great afterwards. He has a pretty interesting Minority Report thing going in those episodes, but they kind of ditch it afterwards with a asylum thing, and then he's just a generic bad guy in the finale. Episode 4 is similarly bland until the ending. Only thing I have to say about the rest of the episode is that it's odd how they gave Mark all of these abilities, yet he doesn't have the one ability he actually has in the books, which is coming back to life. Anyway, that ending, remember I mentioned they try to convince you that all the things earlier in the show weren't real and nobody fell for it? Yeah, that's this bit. They try to pull the asylum stuff from the Jeff Lemire Moon Knight series, but they fail to understand why that works. It works because we watch how this place abuses Mark, and we're given conflicting points as to what is real and what isn't. The show's answer to this is that Mark and Steven just teleport from whatever plot stuff they're doing into Dr. Harrow's office to do stuff. I don't think they ever actually explain why this happens either, like it just happens for no particular reason. Just continues to happen after they get out of the afterlife, so it wasn't just that. Episode 5, this is the one with the most to discuss. They change up the actual origin of Mark's DID to be more accurate to how the actual disorder works, which is a change I agree with. I don't agree with what they actually changed it to, though. The comics version was that Mark was attacked by a Nazi serial killer who disguised himself as his rabbi as a child. I don't need to explain the issue with the whole rabbi-Nazi thing and why that should be changed, but I do take issue with the fact that they removed the anti-Semitism from his background almost entirely. In fact, they removed his religion almost entirely. Left to a Star of David Stephen wears around his neck into a scene where Mark beats his kippah. This could be a really effective scene, but they don't take the time to actually explore his relationship with his religion before this. Go the whole show without realizing he even is Jewish before this. Also cut most of his relationship with his dad who was originally a rabbi, his dad whose refusal to fight against anti-Semitic attacks he faced drove Mark to leave for the military, which led to his becoming a mercenary, which led to him becoming Moon Knight. Changing this takes away the majority of depth from his origin and just makes him far less interesting. Also, consider that a lot of what leads Mark in the books to take Khonshu's offer is his guilt and anger towards a god who he feels abandoned his people. There's a great thread by Moon Knight Archive on Twitter that goes more in depth with this point. I'll link it in the description. The actual origin of his DID the show does give us is fine, I guess, but it never actually reaches a conclusion. The idea is introduced and then quickly abandoned. Mark never actually acknowledges how he was treated after this, and it feels like a wasted opportunity. Clearly the creators agree with me, considering they cut a scene of this from the show. Usually in the finale there would have been a scene where Mark confronted his mother. They cut this for some fucking reason. The actual origin scene is pretty good, actually. It feels odd to me that he doesn't actually die in this version, but that's really my only issue with it. It's well executed, well shot, and the main theme kicks in at just the right moment. It's just a cool scene. Speaking of the theme, it's really good. The entire soundtrack is, and of course, Man Without Love, Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go, and My Way of Life are all great too. It's also shot a lot better than most of these shows. That's not much of a compliment considering what his competition is, but still. CGI is bad, but after looking at She-Hulk and Thor 4, I don't see much point in complaining about this show specifically. Episode 6. The later portion is actually pretty good. She becomes a hero, which I'm fine with. It's not like anyone gave a shit about the comics version of fucking Scarlet Scarab in the first place. The show's only good fight scene, which is cut off partway through. Everyone under the sun has already talked about this, but this is such a baffling decision. Why? Why was this done? It's also in service of setting up a twist that is not only incredibly obvious, but it also ruins a great character and is ableist. Go back to my old description of Jake Lockley. Jake is cool, charming, and a bit of a scoundrel. He can have a temper, but he's also got a heart of gold. He won't fight you without a reason. Does this sound like the Jake in the show? Jake is only on screen for 30 seconds and is already very different. For one, he's a lot quieter and a lot more brutal. He shot down seemingly innocent hospital workers, he kicked over a wheelchair for some reason, and he shoots a guy who serves no threat point blank. He's Khonshu's slave here, which is not a role he should fit. It's not a role the original Jake would fit. It's also ableist. There's a negative stereotype for DID in practically every piece of media with a character who suffers from it. The evil alter. A character suffering for DID will typically have an evil alter within them, who just wants to fucking kill people or something. Shocking though, most people with DID don't have a fucking serial killer for an alter. It's made even more ableist from the fact that Jake wasn't initially like this. In Moon Knight stories people actually like anyways, we'll get to it later. All of this makes a character who is not only unlike the Jake Lockley of the books, ruins the entire final battle, and is also an example of an extremely negative and unfortunately common ableist trope. There are a couple of reasons the show was like this. Part of it was because of the books they chose to pull from. They chose to pull from the universally hated Moon Knight run by Max Bemis alongside the universally hated event where Mark fought the Avengers, known as Age of Khonshu. They pulled the whole Jake Lockley thing and Arthur Harrow from Bemis's book, and they also took the abilities and lack of reality questioning and the fantasy elements from Age of Khonshu. I also think a lot of the forced comedy could be because of Moon Knight Corps' fake panels. No hate to Moon Knight Corps though, I love that account. It's clear why they chose these. Taking from Age of Khonshu allows them to stand side by side with the Avengers in the future, and taking from Bemis' rendition of Jake lets them set up future movies. Because that's how this is, set up. That's the only reason this gets made. That's the only reason any of these movies or shows get made. And the other changes they made, Stephen as Mr. Knight, the lack of confusion in whether certain elements are real, the globe-trotting, is all to make it simpler. To take the teeth and claws off of the books to make them into a shell of what it could have been. This is the version of Moon Knight most people will know from now on. When you mention Moon Knight to someone on the street, this is the version they'll think of. When they put Moon Knight in future shows, MCU or not, it'll resemble this Moon Knight, because that's the only Moon Knight people will know. The Moon Knight books were these great, dark, shockingly deep and very weird books about mental illness, bigotry, abuse, and things that none of these MCU products will ever touch. And it's a damn shame, but it's not a unique issue. It's happened to Thor, it's happened to Hulk, and it'll keep happening. So if you take anything from this, then I implore you to check out the Moon Knight books. These are pretty great, and you can check out the video in the description by Russian Comic Book Geek. It's a dubbing of one of his best comic runs. It's only an hour long. If you want to see what Moon Knight is supposed to be like, check that out. It doesn't really involve his Judaism much, or his altars, but it's a near perfect introduction to Mark. If you'd rather read, you can start anywhere. His current ongoing is a pretty great starting point, doesn't really require much knowledge of his history to read. And it's also really, really good. I'll put links to all the books in the description and to a great reading order if you want to read the highlights. Thanks for listening to me ramble about this for so long. If you'd like the show, that's fine. I just wanted to voice my gripes with it. You can see my Twitter in the description if you want, I guess. Goodbye.